Alrighty, so this week will be much like last week. So it'll be passages, and we'll talk about some passages and kind of what they mean, some of the more complicated issues, or maybe things that maybe you didn't think about or some connections maybe you didn't make as you were reading through. So first, Jesus as the I am of Exodus 3:14. So at John 8:54 through 59, and we will be most of these will be in passages. So if you want to turn to those when we go, that's fine. I'll tell you if it's just going to be a short thing, and then so that you don't have to turn to them. John 8:54, it says, Jesus answered, "If I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. But you have not known him. I know him. If I were to say that I do not know him, I would be a liar like you, but I do know him, and I keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad." So the Jews said to him, "You are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham?" Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. Okay? So, and Zach preached on several of these one time, and it's funny because I think he actually skipped this one, which I thought was interesting. And so there are several places in John's gospel where Jesus says, I am the life, or I am the light, or any number of things where he says, I am whatever, right? And that sounds fairly normal, right? I mean, he can say those things and, he can mean them however he means them, symbolically or whatever it may be. And, you pretty much just say, well, he's just saying he is those things. Well, this one stands out because it's grammatically awkward, right? He says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." And this is the one that jumps out and shows you that these I am statements are actual claims to divinity, right? And so if you look back, and where that comes from is it comes back to Exodus 3:14, where you have Yahweh in the burning bush, and it says at Exodus 3:14, God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you," right? And so the Hebrew behind that, and it's a little complicated, so I'm not going to go into all the detail, but there's a form of the Hebrew word behind I am who I am, right? And then another form of that word is ultimately what we get today as Yahweh, right? And so when we talk about the personal name of God, Yahweh, it comes from that passage, Exodus 3:14, where he says, "I am who I am." So when Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am," he is claiming to be the I am of Exodus 3:14, which is clearly God, right? And so again, you look at Jesus and you say, well, did Jesus ever say, "Hey guys, I'm God"? No, he didn't say that, but he said many other things that clearly they understood to mean that he was claiming to be God. And that's why they pick up stones to throw at him, because it's blasphemy as far as they're concerned, because he claims to be God, right? If I claim to be God, you would all be pretty offended, right? And so that's the way they looked at Jesus, but of course Jesus is God and proved to be God. And the way that he proved to be God is because he was able to perform miracles. And as we'll talk about later, if he was not from God, or the things that he said was not true, then God would not have allowed him, or the Father would not have allowed his miracles to work, right? And that's the stamp of approval from God the Father, is that his miracles actually work. And the Jewish officials actually make that connection. Some of them are like, well, how could a man who's not with God do these things? Like, clearly something's going on here. This is a short one. You can turn there if you want. Jesus saw Satan fall from heaven at Luke 10:17 and 18. This is when, so if you'll remember, Jesus, and we'll break them all down. So Jesus has his three core closest disciples, right? He's got James, John, and Peter, right? They're his core disciples. Then he has the 12, which make up the ultimate group of his main disciples. Then you have here, he sent out 72 disciples, right? And so you have a larger group of disciples that have gone out and they've been casting out demons and such, right? So they come back and they're excited. They're like, hey, we've been casting out demons in your name and it works, And so at Luke 10, 17, and 18, it says, the 72 returned with joy, saying, Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name. And he said to them, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Well, that seems really random if you just look at the passage. Like they're like, hey, we're so excited, and then he's like, I saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning. And they're like, wait, what? Like, okay, right? So what is that exactly? It's probably, and there's two ways to read the verb. It is probably a better translation to say, I was watching Satan fall from heaven like lightning. And the point is that they've come in and they've told him, look, all of these demons are subject to our will in your name. And what Jesus is saying there is, through what you're telling me and what you've been doing, I see Satan falling from heaven, right? He ultimately does not lose access to heaven, according to Revelation 12, until the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, right? And so what he's saying here is that through the spread of the gospel, and in particularly here, through the casting out of demons and all of that, through that those actions, Satan is losing his access from heaven as this goes. And as the gospel continues to spread, Satan loses more and more of his power. And I don't want to say power, because one thing we don't want to do, and I was actually in a forum the other day and somebody was talking about it, we don't want to give Satan too much credit, right? Because Satan is not anywhere near powerful like God, right? He is a created being, created by God, and he's not omnipresent, right? We always think of Satan as he's omnipresent. There's nowhere in the Bible that claims that Satan is omnipresent. He's a divine being, just like all the other created divine beings that are in, that are created by God, right? And so, but that seems to be what's going on here, is that through the spreading of the gospel and through the casting out of demons, Satan is losing out, right? And so that's what he seems to be saying there. What limitations can I put on who is my neighbor? Because I don't want to like everybody, right? Because people are annoying. Yes. And so if I have to love my neighbor, then what I want to do is I want to make sure that my neighbor is as few people as possible so that I don't get to be put out, right? Obviously, that's not the case. But that's what's happening in Luke 10, 25 through 29, right? So it says at Luke 10, 25 through 29, and behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, what is written in the law? How do you read it? Notice that Jesus turns it around on him, right? And he says, well, how do you read it? What do you think, right? And he answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, you have answered correctly. Do this and you will live. But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Right? First of all, note that the command to love God is at Deuteronomy 6:5, which says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And then the command to love your neighbor is probably taken from Leviticus 19:18, which says, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Right? And so he asked Jesus the question, right? And then Jesus turns it around on him. He says, well, how do you read it? And then he answers correctly. And he says, love God and love your neighbor as yourself, right? And Jesus says, correct, you got it, right? So do that and you'll be good. Well, now he's like, well, wait a minute, that didn't work out like I wanted it to. And so he's like, and I have to love my neighbor? Like, okay, well, who is my neighbor? Because look, if I have to love my neighbor as myself, then I need to know who is defined as my neighbor, right? Is it the people that live in my house? Is it the people who live on either side of me next door? Is it the people I work with? Is it the people I go to church with? Like, who is my neighbor? That's what the lawyer wants to know. He's like, well, okay, well, he's not saying, could you please define for me the total number of people that I get to love? He's saying, can you please define for me who my neighbor is so that I don't waste time attempting to love people that I don't like, right? Which obviously is ridiculous. Now, let me just say, some people are harder to love than others, right? But that's part of it. And note that Jesus is about to hit him with some pretty harsh stuff, right? So at Luke 10:30, starting there. And I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I think most of us know the parable of the Good Samaritan, but I do want to read through it just for to go over a couple of points. Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. So note, you have a priest and a Levite. A priest, of course, is a priest, and a Levite is a person who works at the temple, right? So it would be like if you're, it'd be like the preacher and your Sunday school teacher, right? They completely passed you on the other side of the road. And the reason that they probably passed him, I mean, obviously and listen, this is a parable, right? So, but likely, if these were real people and you asked them, they would say, well, I didn't want to be unclean in case he was dead, right? So that would have probably been their excuse for not stopping. But that's still not okay, right? But a Samaritan, right? And when Jesus says, but a Samaritan, all of his Jewish audience would have automatically, all of their hairs would have stood up and they would have become angry thinking, if he says that the Samaritan helps the man, then we're going to freak out. Because if you remember, the Samaritans are the northern kingdom of Israel, right? And then they're exiled, many of them, and other people are imported into the northern kingdom of Israel from other places. Those people intermingle, and then that's the Samaritans that ultimately show up in Jesus' day, right? Those are the people. Jewish people would not even go through the land if they could prevent it. They would go around, right? And so they hated them. They had their own Bible, which is called we call it today the Samaritan Pentateuch. It's just the first 5 books of Moses with some changes from what we would look at in the Old Testament. And they had some different beliefs and stuff, right? And so they were hated. It would be like today if you said your preacher didn't stop, your Sunday school teacher didn't stop, and a radical Muslim terrorist stopped by and helped you, right? That's the way that it would have been perceived by Jesus's audience. And then, of course, he helps him, and that's the parable. The point being, everyone is your neighbor, right? In other words, like the worst hated person that you could imagine, that's your neighbor, right? Note that at the end of it, it's always interesting. Jesus says at 10:36 and then at 37, it says, which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers, right? So he's throwing the question at him and making him answer. And notice it says, he said, the one who showed him mercy. He can't even say the Samaritan because that would be sickening to him to say that a Samaritan would have stepped up when a Levite and a priest did not. All right, Pontius Pilate. And why bad things happen to good people, or a revisit of the retribution principle that we talked about in Job, right? So at Luke 13, 1 through 5, Luke 13, 1 through 5, it says, there were some present at that very time who told him about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. And he answered them, do you think that these Galileans were worse sinners than all the other Galileans because they suffered in this way? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. Or those 18 on whom the tower of Siloam fell and killed them, do you think that they were worse offenders than all the others who lived in Jerusalem? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. So two things here. First of all, Pontius Pilate. So Pontius Pilate, of course, is the Roman governor for all intents and purposes. And he's the one, of course, who allows Jesus to be crucified, has him whipped and all of those things. And obviously he did those things, but Pontius Pilate gets a fairly positive look in the Gospels, right? They talk about how he didn't want to do it and all these different things. And I think that can kind of make us think that, Pontius Pilate just got stuck between a rock and a hard place and, he tried, whatever. Pontius Pilate was a horrible person, right? He was highly anti-Semitic. He had, there was one instance where the Jews were angry at him for some of the things that he had done. And so he had been told by Rome that if there was another riot in his area, then he would be recalled, right? And he would be punished. And so he thought, well, I don't want all these Jewish people out here, demonstrating, but I can't send soldiers out. So what should I do? So what he does is he gets them and dresses them in plain clothes, gives them clubs, and then they go out and beat all of the Jewish people to death for demonstrating, right? Also in AD 36, which is when he's recalled, he sent troops who ended up killing a group of Samaritans who were on a pilgrimage to Mount Gerizim to worship. They were going, they thought the Messiah was there or something, but they were going to this place, and they sent the soldiers, and they ended up killing them. So he was a bad guy. The reason that he later, kind of a spoiler alert, the reason likely that he doesn't immediately have Jesus crucified is because the Jews want him crucified. And he figures he can jerk them around and not have it done, and that'll make them mad, right? But then once they basically allude to the possibility of a riot, he then allows Jesus to be crucified, right? Note that Jesus is asking them if these people somehow deserved to die, right? So in the case of Pilate killing one group and then a tower falling on another group, and he says no, of course, right? And again, he is speaking out against what we call the retribution principle, right? Which again is the ancient belief, and still today, you get it in the prosperity gospel, that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, right? And if you're good enough and you pray enough and you're pious enough, then only good things will happen to you. But if you're bad or if you've sinned in some way, then bad things happen. So I can know if, God forbid, something happens to you, well, obviously you're a sinner. You've obviously done something bad because all these bad things are happening to you. Well, obviously, if you think about it for 2 seconds, right? We know that that's not the case, right? Bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people all the time. Right? And so that is what Jesus is speaking out against there, is this whole idea of the retribution principle, which is going to come up again, and which clearly Jesus' own disciples understand to be a fact, the retribution principle, that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. Because at John 9, starting at 9:16, and we're going to talk about several things that happen here at John 9:16 and following, about Jesus healing the blind man, right? And so starting at 9:16, it says, some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath, right? So they're like, he doesn't follow all the rules, so he's clearly not from God, right? But others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs, right? And note that signs means miracles. And there was division among them, right? So note that the others are correct. They're exactly correct. If he wasn't from God, he wouldn't be able to do all of these miracles. And they're clearly miracles. The big one being that he raises Lazarus from the dead, but he raised other people from the dead as well, right? So then jumping to 9:28, they're now talking to the blind man, right? And so they're really making fun of him is what ultimately happens. Note they get his parents there, and his parents won't even say anything. They're like, has your son been blind from birth? And they're like, yes, he was not blind from birth. And they're like, well, what happened? And they're like, we have no idea. You'll have to ask him, because they don't want to get kicked out of the synagogue, right? So like if you did something, say for instance here, let's say, I don't know, something, you did something at the church and, made people mad or whatever, right? You spoke too much in Joe Turner's class and you got excommunicated, right? You're out of the church. You got to go somewhere. Well, what would you do? You just go to another church, right? I mean, obviously you don't want to go to another church, but I mean, in other words, it's not like you would lose your religion. You could go to another church. Not so in Judaism, right? In other words, you would be excommunicated is not a word that they would use, but you would lose your religion, right? In other words, they would say you can't possibly go to the afterlife. Of course, they wouldn't know what that looked like. They'd be like, whatever that looks like, right? But you wouldn't be able to go to the afterlife. You're no longer a child of God because you've done whatever this thing is, right? And that's what they're looking at, is if the parents say the wrong thing, they'll just kick them out of the synagogue. And you can't just go to another synagogue, right? You've lost. You're out, right? And they don't want that, because obviously that would be a problem. It's a little more like the Catholic Church. If you're in the Catholic Church, you can be excommunicated from the Catholic Church, and then you would be out, right? So in other words, it would be more like that, where you would, if you were Catholic, obviously, that would be a concern for you, that, you would be excommunicated. So at 9:28, and they reviled him, saying, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from, right? Which is a problem that they don't know. The man answered, why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered him, you were born in utter sin, and would you teach us? And they cast him out, right? So again, they've kicked him out, right? So they're like, you're no longer Jewish, right? So now note first that here you have this guy blind from birth and uneducated, right, as far as they're concerned. And yet he is schooling them on what's going on here. Like, it's obvious. Like, he's like, how could you even consider this? Like, clearly he's from God because he's able to do all these things. Like, I mean, I didn't go to private schools and I knew that. How do you not know that, right? And then they get mad and they kick him out, right? But he is exactly correct. Note the retribution principle at John 9, 1 through 3, right, which is part of the story. This is where they come up on him. It says, as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? So note, they're like, well, somebody sinned. Who was it? Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him, right? And so in other words, God is going to use this situation of his being born blind in order to glorify God. But note, in the previous section, the religious leaders are also arguing for the retribution principle. When they asked there at that end of that previous section, they answered him, you were born in utter sin, and would you teach us? And they cast him out, right? So they're saying the reason that you're blind, as the disciples were thinking, you were born blind, so therefore you're a sinner, and yet you're going to talk to us about right and wrong? Because they have that idea that since you're blind, you either must have done something later on yourself, because again, God can judge people before, right? So they're thinking, well, you're blind, so you obviously are a terrible sinner, right? And so again, it's that whole idea of good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. And in both of these instances that we've talked about, Jesus said, no, that's not the case. And just for the record, as you go throughout the Bible, you find different reasons, right? Sometimes it is because of sin, because Jesus says, stand up and walk, your sins are forgiven. Well, for whatever reason, that did have to do with sin. Here, it had to do with glorifying God. In the previous passage where the tower fell and the other people died, he's basically making the point, I mean, are they sinners because they died? And so there's could be any number of reasons that things happen. So for us to automatically, like if, God forbid I become, terminally ill or something, my first thought should not be, oh, I'm a terrible sinner, right? It's just bad things happen to good people, right? I mean, that would be my first thought, right? Or in my case, bad things happen to at least decent people, right? All right, John 10, 14 through 16, and Jesus's other sheep. And I think oftentimes, again, we think of, and listen, Jesus' ministry, again, and we talked about this last week, it was to the Jewish people first, right? The Jewish people would be the ones most likely to understand his message because they're looking for their Messiah. He is their Messiah. And so that's why it goes to the Jews first. It takes less time to explain, and then they can still be a light to the nations, just like they were meant to be in the Old Testament, and then spread the word of God, the gospel in this case, to the nations. However, Jesus clearly states in several places that that's the ultimate goal, is for the message to go to the nations, right? And I think oftentimes people look at it as the Jews were supposed to listen and they didn't, so therefore God went to the Gentiles. No, that's not the case. Certainly there were Jewish people who did listen. All of his first disciples were Jewish people, right? And then it goes to the nations, just like the program was supposed to go in the first place. This has always been the point. And Jesus says it right here at John 10, 14 through 16. He says, I'm the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Bless you. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold, right? So note that the sheep of this fold are the Jewish people. But then he has other sheep that are not of this fold, right? I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock and one shepherd. There's no separate program for Jews and Christians. They're all together. Just like Paul says, there's neither Jew nor Greek. Here Jesus says, so there will be one flock and one shepherd. There's no differences at this point, right? And so you have, in the Old Testament, you have the Jewish people who are God's people. You have Gentiles that can be converted into Judaism. You get to the New Testament, you have Jewish people looking for the Jewish Messiah. Jewish people who accept Jesus as the Messiah, those people are saved according to the New Testament. And you also have Gentiles who also accept the Jewish Messiah. Those people are also saved. All of those people are called Christians. There's no difference between them. The promises that were given to Israel in the Old Testament are given to all those people who accept the Jewish Messiah in the New Testament. There's not a different program. And I think oftentimes we hear that, right? Where it's like, well, something special is going to happen for the Jews versus the Christians. There's only one way, right, to get to heaven or the afterlife, the positive afterlife, right? And that's through salvation through Jesus, right? Through belief in Jesus as, the Messiah. And so, again, there's not separate ways to get there. All right, this is the most complicated thing that we'll talk about. At John 10, 31 through 36. It says the Jews picked up stones again to stone him. Jesus answered them, I have shown you many good works from the Father. For which of them are you going to stone me? The Jews answered him, it is not for a good work that we are going to stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself God. Jesus answered them, is it not written in your law, I said you are gods? If he called them gods to whom the word of God came, and scripture cannot be broken, Do you say of him whom the Father consecrated and sent into the world, you are blaspheming because I said, I am the Son of God? Right? So what is this whole idea about that God said you could be gods? So Moses' note is referred to as a god to Pharaoh. And the meaning there is, because he's speaking the word of God, he is like God. At Exodus 7:1, it says, and the Lord said to Moses, see, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet, right? And so there you have an example of someone being like God. But this is more likely talking about Psalm 82, and we'll look at 1 through 6, which we have talked about before. It says at Psalm 82, 1, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment, right? And so note that word for gods is Elohim, which is both singular when it's talking about God, which that first word there, God has taken his place. It's Elohim. It is a plural word. And when we use it for Yahweh, it's singular, right? It's God. But then when we use it for other gods, it's plural, right? So you have it both, interestingly, singular for God and plural for other gods right here. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Okay? So note first, the first thing you have to do is interpret who are we talking about, right? Who are these gods? Well, the first is what we've talked about in the past when we talked about sons of God and we talked about the divine council and all of those things. One interpretation is that these are created, regardless they're created beings, right? We're not talking about other gods equal to Yahweh ever, right? The Bible doesn't teach anything like that ever. But that these are created and fallen divine beings that God put over the nations at that time, and they're referred to as gods, though they are obviously not the one true God, right? And so this is what Paul would be talking about when he said what the pagans worship, their actual demons, right? And so this is what we would be talking about here. We would be talking about the demons themselves, which again are fallen angels, if you will, right? The other interpretation is that they are humans being referred to as gods because they're kings, they're leaders, and so they're being referred to as gods in this case because they're over other people. Again, they're clearly not gods at the same level as Yahweh is, regardless of which of those you're looking at. And regardless of which interpretation you take, there are examples in the Old Testament where beings who are not Yahweh are referred to as gods, right? Again, there's no belief that they're on the same level as Yahweh, but they're referred to as gods because of the power that they hold over other people in their respective domains. Again, whether they be divine beings or angels that were put over nations, or whether they're human kings over nations, they're over nations and they hold a lot of power, and so they're referred to as gods. If we can refer to those humans and or divine beings as gods, then certainly we can refer to Jesus, the Son of God, as a God, right? And so that's the point that he's making. He's saying, I am more special than all of those people and or divine beings, and so therefore I can be referred to as a God or as God myself. It's a very complicated, it's weird. It's a particularly complicated passage, and it has to be that there's some understanding among John's audience about all of that for him just to break it out and bring it up about the gods and stuff. But clearly it seems to be that he's referencing Psalm 82. Part of the problem there is the exact interpretation of that. Table seating etiquette in the Greco-Roman world at Luke 14, 7 through 9. Yeah, I have to name each of the sections that I do so that I know what I'm about to talk about when I see it. And so I don't know, sometimes I get creative. Luke 14:7-9. Now he told a parable to those who were invited. When he noticed how they chose the places of honor, saying to them, when you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in a place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him. And he who invited you both will come and say to you, give your place to this person, and then you will begin with shame to take the lowest place. Right? And so what's going on here? All right, so two things. First of all, in the ancient, or in the Greco-Roman world particularly, you had a very low table, and you had pillows, and what you would do is you would recline on your arm like this, laying down, completely on your side, on your elbow like this, and then you would eat this way, right? So you're literally laying down and eating like this, because they didn't really have, like in most houses and stuff, you have no furniture because you don't have room for furniture. You basically have one or maybe two rooms, plus your roof that you can do stuff on, right? So the Last Supper was probably on a roof. And so there's no space to like put chairs and stuff, right? And so you would lay down and you would recline on your side. This is why the Gospel of John can refer to the beloved disciple reclining against Jesus at the Last Supper, right? Because they're literally laying down and they're kind of, on each other as they're laying there. So then what's this about? So Da Vinci's painting, where they're all sitting at that nice table and they got the big, thing. And not that there's anything wrong with Da Vinci's painting, except for the fact that it's completely factually inaccurate, right? Beautiful painting, but not culturally appropriate, right? So then what's this deal about sitting and losing your place and having to go to a low place? So in general, what you would do is you would have the area that you're at, and you would have the person of honor would be, say, here, right? And then other people who had places of honor would then sit closest to that person, and as it worked its way around, you would get less and less status, right? And so what Jesus is teaching here is about being humble. He says, don't just go in and sit closest to the person of honor, assuming that you're like important. Sit at the lowest place. Because if you sit at a high place of honor, and then the person of honor comes in, and they're like, well, I invited Bob, and he's more important than you, so sorry, you're going to have to get up and move lower down the table. He's saying, don't let that happen. That would be embarrassing. He says, so sit at the lowest place. And have the person of honor come to you and say, hey, no, you deserve to be closer up. You move this way, right? And again, the point being, you need to be humble, right? And be prepared to take the lowest place and then be graduated up if that's the case. But don't just automatically assume that you get a place of honor, right? All right, the invitees snub God's feast at Luke 14:15-24. It says, when one of those who reclined at table with him heard these things, he said to him, blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God, right? So he's like, man, it's going to be great. Jesus is like, you probably won't be there. But he said to him, a man once gave a great banquet and invited many. And at the time for the banquet, he sent his servant to say to those who had been invited, come, for everything is now ready. But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, I have bought a field and I must go and see it. Please have me excused. And another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen and I go to examine them. Please have me excused. And another one said, I have married a wife and therefore cannot come. So the servant came and reported these things to his master. Then the master of the house became angry and said to his servant, go out quickly to the streets and lanes of the city and bring in the poor and crippled and blind and lame. And the servant said, sir, what you commanded has been done, and still there is room. And the master said to the servant, go to the highways and hedges and compel people to come in, that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those men who were invited shall taste my banquet. And so the point here again is the original people who are invited to the banquet in general are the Jewish people, right? And so it's, again, because you've got to remember in the context of the Jewish people at this point are very they're racist, right? And so they believe because they are God's people that everyone else is just way lower than them, right? So these people are just animals, right? We're God's people. We have privilege, and everybody else is just disgusting, right? And so what Jesus is saying is, look, we're going to be opening up to where those people get an opportunity as well. And you've gotten all high and mighty, and you're making extra rules and stuff that are just wearing down the people that are trying to worship God, but you're basically not allowing them because you keep adding all of these extra rules and stuff, right? And so so you think that you have a place at the table, but you don't. You're going to lose your invitation, right? And so that's the point, is that there will be other people whom you did not expect who will actually end up making it in. And the people who expected to make it in, many of those people are not going to make it in, right? And so again, as an ancient Jewish person, that would have been a shocker, right? It would be like the Samaritan thing. They'd be like, wait a minute, you're saying Gentiles are going to get in and I'm not? No, right? But that's what he's saying. All right, Jesus gets salty at Luke 14, 34 through 35. He says, salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Okay, so note, in the ancient world, salt was used for both flavor and as a preservative, right? And it was well known that pure salt could not lose its saltiness, right? Like that seems to be the kind of the joke here, right? Is that there's no chance that it's going to lose its saltiness. Though there is a possibility that if we're talking about salt from the Dead Sea, it is possible that in the process of extracting just the salt from the water, that it would be varying degrees. But I don't think so. I think it's the ridiculous idea that salt could ever lose its saltiness, right? That's the point that he's making. If you're really salty, then you're not going to lose your saltiness, right? But if you weren't in the first place, then you won't make it. And interestingly, so I have an example from outside the Bible, of course, that where we have a joke, right? I stumbled across several jokes from the Talmud. So if you'll remember, we talked about the law, right? Obviously, in the Old Testament. There's 613 laws in the Old Testament. Then we have what's called the Mishnah, right? Which is the oral law on top of the law. So that's what we call like the case law. And then we have what's called the Talmud, which is a larger multi-volume work now. And it is commentary on the law, right? So it's commentary on the Mishnah and the law. And so they're called tracts. In one of the tracts, there were several jokes. And so here's a joke from the Talmud, right? So here's an ancient Jewish joke about salt. So the rabbi asks, he says, when salt loses its flavor, how do you salt the salt? He said to them, with the afterbirth of a mule. And does a mule have an afterbirth? He said to them, and does salt lose its flavor? Right? So note that mules they can't give birth, right? And so so the point is, he says, how do you resalt salt, right? And he's like, well, with the afterbirth of a mule, which is again ridiculous because mules don't have afterbirth. And so then he's like, can salt lose its saltiness? No, of course. And that's the point that he's making. Just like a mule's not going to have afterbirth, salt's not going to lose its saltiness, right? So whether do what? A dumb joke. Well, yeah. It is an ancient joke, right? But again, you get the point, right? And the point is to teach. So whether we're talking about as a flavoring or as a preservative, note that if it loses its desired properties, salt, then it is like any other useless mineral deposit, right? Just as if a disciple loses his or her desired properties, right? His desire and willingness to spread the gospel, then he or she becomes indistinguishable from the world. They become worthless, just like any other ungodly person, right? And that's the point that he's making. All right, the Rich Man and Lazarus, and we're not going to read it. Note that this story is a parable, and I think oftentimes we think that every parable has to start with, and Jesus told them this parable, but that's not the case, right? We recognize parables based on stories, you know, the way they start and the nature of their stories. It would be like if I started, you know, there once was a princess in a castle, right? Well, you would automatically be like, well, he's clearly not going to tell me a real story, right? And so it's the same thing here. Notice that at Luke 16:19, you don't have to turn to it because it's just the one verse. He says, there was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen and who feasted sumptuously every day. And then he goes on and tells you about the rich man and this poor man named Lazarus who he refused to feed, right? This is not Lazarus who Jesus raised from the dead, right? And so note, I think people will often look at this and they'll try to get all kinds of different theological deals out of it. Well, it's just a parable. And the point of the parable is that once you've made your decision and you die, that's it. You have no second chance. You can't go back and right that wrong, right? Once you don't get to, you know, like, well, I don't know, I don't think I believe in God. And then you die and there's God and you're like, well, you know what? I want to go back and take that back, right? I think I'd like to change the way I did things. No, right? That's the point of the parable, is you don't get to change once you've done it. So you need to make the right decision before that point. All right.
But at the end of that parable, he asked him to send him to his brother.
And he can't. That's the point. Yeah, he can't. So you can't warn other people too, because he begins to feel bad and he's like, oh my goodness, I need to tell other people. He's like, no, you're dead. You're done. Like you lost the chance to do all those things. If you had been saved, you know, like now we call it saved. If you had been saved and then you had spread the gospel to your family, then that would have been good. And again, the point is for the person hearing the parable to say, oh, snap, I don't want to make that wrong decision. Let me go talk to my brother, you know, and let me get right and do all that right now, right? It was oh snap, wasn't it? Does that get you? You just laugh. It's really, it makes me laugh inside as I'm teaching. All right. All right, the Jewish officials plot against Jesus at John 11:47 through 50. It says, so the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, what are we to do? For this man performs many signs. Yes, he does. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Is that true?
If there's more junk, yeah.
Yeah, because he's claiming to be, according to their understanding, the Jewish Messiah, which in their understanding means he's a human king who's going to come in and kick out whatever world power is there at the time, and it happens to be Rome, right? So they're like, he's going to bring the Romans down on us if everybody starts following him and tries to make him king. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. Is he correct? Yes. And that's exactly what ends up happening, although not in the way he understands it, right? He thinks that by killing Jesus or having Jesus killed, then that will stop the Romans. It will save them from the Romans coming down on them, where in reality, it saves them from sins if they accept, right? So those who accept. And so that, again, shows in John, which is a major theme in John, is misunderstanding. They misunderstand Jesus as a earthly king Messiah who's going to come in and fight the Romans. And that's what everybody believed. That's what Jesus' own disciples believed. They don't understand until he's raised from the dead. And he tells Pontius Pilate, he says, because Pilate's saying, so are you the king of the Jews? And he says, my kingdom is not of this earth, right? It's a spiritual kingdom. So that's the point. And that's what Pontius Pilate is saying. If Jesus says, yeah, I'm going to get a bunch of people together and we're going to, kill you and we're going to kill, we're going to take it all the way to Caesar and kill him too. Then he's like, okay, well, then you're going to die, right? But he doesn't do those. He doesn't say those things, right? And when he says it's a spiritual kingdom, he's like, oh, is that all, right? Turns out that was pretty important. That was the important part. All right, what will it be like at the return of Christ? All right, and this is going to be something that many people seriously misunderstand. At Luke 17, 26 through 27, starting there, notice it says, just as it was in the days of Noah. All right, just as it was in the days of Noah, so will it be in the days of the Son of Man. So we're talking about at the second coming. They were eating and drinking and marrying and being given in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all. Okay, now ask yourself this question. Who was taken out and who was left behind? Were godly people left behind or were godly people taken out? Godly people were left behind. Yeah, the godly people are left behind. The evil people are taken out for destruction, right?
So you're saying that Noah and his family were the only godly people?
Yeah, that's what it says. Yeah, so they're left behind on the earth, right? In other words, obviously they're on the water, but they're left behind on the earth, right? And the ungodly people are taken away. Likewise, at 28, just as it was in the days of Lot, they were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But on the day when Lot went out from Sodom, fire and sulfur rained from heaven and destroyed them all. So, and even though technically, just for the record though, Lot wasn't necessarily godly, but he was more godly than the other people because he showed the angels hospitality, right? And tried to protect them. So that was the only reason he got saved, because he was going with the rest of them, right? And then they did that, and then it saved his family. So were the ungodly people taken away for destruction, or were they left behind on the earth? They were taken away, right? And then the godly, yes, people, let's just say that, the godlier people, if you will, they're left behind on the earth. They stay there. They survive, right? So will it be on the day when the Son of Man is revealed. On that day, let the one who is on the housetop with his goods in the house not come down to take them away. And likewise, let the one who is in the field not turn back. Remember Lot's wife. Whoever seeks to preserve his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life will keep it. I tell you, in that night there will be two in one bed. One will be taken and the other left. But note, just like in the days of Noah and Lot, this passage is saying that you don't want to be taken. Those people are taken for destruction. The ones who are left, they're the ones who are going to be saved, right? And again, those are the people who inherit the new heavens and the new earth. Those are the people who stay behind on the new heavens and the new earth at the second coming of Christ. There will be two women grinding together. One will be taken and the other left. Again, one will be taken for destruction, the other left.
The whole series is backwards? Left behind.
Yeah, I mean, so look, and you can still make an argument from other passages for, say, the rapture. I would just say that this passage is not about the rapture, right? Or it is not an argument to be made for the rapture. Like, remember when Russ, if you remember, obviously years ago, even he did a series on the rapture, right? And he looked at these passages and he said, just for the record, these passages are not about the rapture, right? And so again, many people will read this backwards and they'll think, well, wait a minute, that's what it's talking about, but it is not. That's not what that's talking about. All right, what's up with tax collectors? So note that a tax collector, basically you would bid out an area, okay? And you would say, okay, I'm gonna take this much taxes for this area for Rome. All right, and then if you win the bid, you are then responsible to pay up front all of the money for that area in taxes. So you would pay everybody's taxes all to Rome at one time, because you're their guarantee, right? That the taxes are going to get paid. But then you can then go to the people and then you take taxes from the people and then you take over and above for your own payment. And you get flexibility as to how much over and above you take, right? And so some people would take more than others. And you may basically make people poor. And Rome wouldn't appreciate that too much because you want people to continue to be able to pay taxes. but they were hated because they were among the people. So if I'm a Jewish person who lives in the area of Judea, and then I bid out to Rome to be a tax collector, well, now I'm taking taxes and stuff for Rome from my own people. And I'm taking money on top of that. And I have the backing of Rome if you don't give me your money. And so I can take the contingent of soldiers that's around, and we can come to your house, and we can, we can take money from you. So that's the reason that tax collectors are so disliked.
IRS.
Yeah, right. All right, I'm not going to read all the stuff about the passage on divorce. I will tell you it's at Matthew 19, 2 through 9, which is where we're going to look at, or kind of what was the background. But note that this discussion is based on Deuteronomy 24:1, which says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house, and then it continues on. So note you have this passage that is saying that men can divorce their wives. Well, it doesn't talk about women divorcing their husbands, even though technically Mark, in the parallel passage to this, he does mention that, strangely enough. But it was very rare for a woman to divorce her husband, right? Because they have no rights. It would have to be an egregious issue for a woman to be granted a divorce from her husband. And so these passages talking about divorce, they're not prescriptive of all divorce situations. The point is that men divorce their wives for no reason. And we know that because right here where it says that because he can divorce her because he has found some indecency in her, note that Rabbi Hillel, which is one of the famous rabbis, he argues that Deuteronomy 24:1 refers to two grounds in the literal rendering, a cause for indecency. And so he'll say that you can divorce your wife either for cause or indecency. And so then, as a rabbi, I get to define cause. And again, and I know we've talked about this before, but one cause that they finally came up with is, well, I say finally, there's several causes, but one of them is if she burns your bread, right? And so the point is, the law says, I interpret it to mean that I can divorce my wife for cause. I would like to be able to easily divorce my wife for any reason, so let's go ahead and define cause. And so they define cause in these ridiculous manners to where you can basically divorce your wife for anything, rendering her completely unable to support herself anymore, right? Because she has no rights. And so what Jesus is talking about is that there's this problem where men are divorcing their wives and leaving them destitute, right? And so he's saying, don't do that. He's saying it's your hardness of heart that Moses even allowed for some room for divorce, and you guys have just lost your minds and gone crazy with it, and you divorce your wives for no reason. Because again, what is a man in this time period going to do once he divorces his wife? He's going to go marry a very, very, very young girl, and then he's going to have more children. That's probably going to be his reasoning for divorcing his wife. So he needs to have cause, so therefore he comes up with cause. Note that another famous rabbi, Shimei, he argues that there's only indecency, right? And so that's a political debate or a religious debate amongst the rabbis. And he's saying, no, it's indecency. And so they would have been more conservative about divorce and said, no, you can only divorce in very specific cases, not for burning bread, right? So that shows that. So Jesus is not saying you can't ever divorce. He's saying, men, you can't just be divorcing your wives for no reason. Now, obviously, the ultimate goal would be to fall in love the person, marry the person, and never get divorced. But Jesus is not saying that any random number of things that we can think of that are good reasons for divorce. He's not saying you can't divorce your spouse. There are some who will say to women who are being abused, they'll say, no, you can't get divorced, right? No, it would go against God. Well, that's a problem, okay? That's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is not saying a woman who's being abused can't divorce her husband, right? That's not the point. Okay, last thing, really quickly. What is the eye of a needle, right? When Jesus says that it is harder for a rich man to enter heaven than a camel to go through an eye of a needle, what does that mean? It means what it says, right? It means literally, again, a ridiculous example, meaning it's very hard for a person who has no earthly desires because they have everything they want to go to heaven because they don't see themselves as dependent on God, right? And so it's not about wealth that's a problem. It's that people who see themselves as not needing anything from God are less likely to turn to God for things, right? Meaning to pray to God or praise God or anything else, because it's like, oh, God, I don't need anything. Well, that's not, first of all, the way that we're supposed to look at God is though we just go to God when we need things, right? But that's the problem. He's saying, and they had needles and they had eyes that you would put thread through. He's saying it's that hard for a camel, a full-grown camel, to go through the eye of a needle. And I say that because some will argue without any base in the ancient world that there was a gate in Jerusalem called the Eye of a Needle. And what they were really saying is a fully loaded camel had a hard time getting under this gate because it was a small gate, and so therefore it couldn't get through. There is no evidence for that, right? There's absolutely no evidence. And I will put that right there just for the record. This is going to break some of your hearts. With the whole idea of when the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, they tied a rope around him in case he died and they could pull him back out. There's no evidence of that, right? That is completely made up. I want to say that the first time anybody ever said that was in like 1300 AD, right? Somebody came up with that idea and said that. There's no evidence in the ancient world, certainly not in the Bible, that anything like that. It's just one of those things that people say that gets, passed down, and you read it and you're like, oh, that sounds smart, and then you say it. So, thanks for watching, and please feel free to leave a comment or question. And if you found this video helpful, hit like. And if you would like to be notified when new videos are released, hit subscribe and join us next time as we study the Bible in context.